Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Amber Nightingale-Sultani, the Associate State Director for Community Outreach with AARP here in Northern Virginia. And I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. AARP Virginia is thrilled to continue our collaboration with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. This collaboration allows us an opportunity to bring our members a sampling of the rich programs that is offered each semester by Ali Mason. From our earliest beginnings, AARP has been a champion of lifelong learning. Our founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrews, once said, "The eagerness to learn, to pioneer in the development of new skills and new abilities, to broaden the personal scopes of understanding, to freshen the mind with new ideas and new concepts, to achieve new heights of knowledge, has no age restriction." Those words are as true today as when she spoke them in the 1950s. Studies have shown that challenging your brain in new ways throughout your life may strengthen your brain. Our brain is stimulated and makes new connections when we learn new things or pursue new interests. So AARP encourages you to stay curious and give yourself a good mental workout by doing something that challenges your thinking, offers you enjoyment, and encourages you to grapple with new and complex ideas. And I hope today's lecture will do that for you and more. Thank you again for joining us.
Greetings and warm welcome from Ali Mason. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University has been in existence for over 30 years. We offer lectures, clubs, special events, and trips, as well as many volunteer opportunities such as teaching and service on committees. There are many things you can learn and do at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. We're very happy to be collaborating today with AARP, and I want to welcome all of our Ali members, as well as those of you who are coming in from Virginia and across the United States. We're very happy that you've joined us today, and we hope that you will look at our website to learn more about Ali at olli.gmu.edu. Please enjoy today's presentation.
Thank you. Everybody can hear me okay, I hope. I hope you'll allow me to keep my mask on today. I do live with someone at home who's immune compromised, so I still have to be as careful as I can for her sake. I'm Steve Barnes. I'm a professor here at George Mason University. I'm in the Department of History and Art History here. I focus on the history of Russia and the Soviet Union. Have done a lot of research over the years in Russia and in Kazakhstan in particular. I teach quite broadly on modern Russian history, the history of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, all of the independent states that came out of that. And I also direct here our program in Russian and Eurasian Studies. So welcome to all of the Ali members in the room. It's nice to see some folks in the room. I'm still teaching entirely online, so it's nice to be in a room with some people for a change. Welcome to everybody that's online with us today. And a special welcome to those who have joined through AARP. I really appreciate that we've been able to partner with them, and Ali has been able to partner with AARP to get this important conversation out to as many people as possible. I'm beyond thrilled that everybody's here. For me, the interest that you take in being here, the interest that you take in being with us online, it's a profound moral statement. You will not let the subject of this war drop into our background, become unimportant and undiscussed. You're making a statement by being here that we will not forget Ukraine, and that we'll also try to understand where this war came from, why it's happening in the way that it is. So this series of 3 events with Ali is designed to accompany a fully online, free, and open to the public lecture series at George Mason University that is itself also part of an undergraduate course that I'm teaching in history at the university this semester. It's also a course here for Ollie, but it's also open to a broader public. The first lecture in that series I'm actually giving, but then we have a series of experts coming to talk to us about this history. We have, as of this morning, well over 300 people registered for the lecture on Monday, which I'm really pleased and excited about. But today the intention is that I provide you with a bit of historical background so that you can better understand the historians who are going to come in the series. Then we're going to have two separate sessions in this series of three. So if you attend a lot of the lectures, like I do, online, in person, right, you often feel like you don't have enough time to ask questions and to have a conversation. And this series is designed for that. It's designed to be a plus and along with that public lecture series for us to be able to have conversations, to ask questions, to share the things that we think about this war, about the speakers who have come, all of those kinds of things. I think you'll get there, I hope, something of the value added that my students are getting, where we have those Monday sessions with public speakers every week. We also have Wednesday sessions together every week where we talk about the people who come, the things that they talk about, try to understand it more. So it gives you a taste of that as well. So what I want to do to start is to return us for a moment to the evening of February 23rd. It was the morning of February 24th in Ukraine. February 23rd happens to be my wife's birthday. And she and I were sitting at home watching a movie when my phone buzzed. And it was a message from a good friend of mine from my Stanford grad school days, a guy who's now a Russian history professor at Dartmouth. It's a chat group actually where we're typically talking about the latest exploits or failures of our favorite NFL teams. Go Chiefs, by the way. Excited that the season starts tonight. But that message that came in on that chat interrupted our movie watching, and I want to read it to you. And I'm going to quote it to get the precise tone right. Maybe I'll make a small edit here. He writes just this: well, absolute effing nightmare is in fact starting. I looked at my phone, I looked at my wife, I said, sorry, honey, I've got to go upstairs and figure out what's going on. I go running up to my son's bedroom, which I use as a home office when he's gone to college. And I launched Twitter and I began listening to breathless reports of attacks on Kiev's airport and other things that were happening as Russia had launched this invasion. And I want to share with you what I wrote to my students that night. And I realize in the room this might be kind of small, so I'll read it to you. Hi, everyone. Russia has launched a dramatic and intense military campaign against Ukraine. I wish I could offer you words of wisdom or explanation right now. I cannot. I'm still absorbing what is happening. I'm heartbroken. I'm terrified. Putin is a terrorist. The immense human suffering that has already begun lies entirely at his doorstep. This was completely unnecessary, and it could get so much worse in so many ways. And so I've spent now the past 6 months trying to understand, trying to make sense of a senseless war, to understand whether Russia, for which I had so much optimism 30 years ago when it became independent of the Soviet Union, to understand where that Russia went wrong. Of course, I really should have spent the last 8 years trying to understand the latest incarnation, but he's actually going back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century. And he believes that Ukrainians are invented at that point, that the Poles are playing a really important role here. But this is how he's operated ever since. Ukrainians do not exist as a separate people. And those who act as if they do exist are nothing more than Nazis. By the beginning of the spring semester in January of this year, troops had, of course, massed again around the borders of Ukraine. And although Russia continued to deny it, I started that semester telling my students that I feared we'd have war before the semester was over. In the early days after February 24th and the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, I'll admit I didn't think Ukraine would be able to stand. I thought it would fall quickly. I was reading what military analysts in the United States and elsewhere were writing. that Kiev would fall perhaps in 3 days. Each week, I feared that Ukraine would fall before the next time I would come back to meet my students. But Ukraine stood up and it fought back. And when offered asylum in the West, the Ukrainian president, Velodimir Zelensky, famously said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." This was an amazing moment. The Ukraine that I had taught about in the past had become something different in the last 8 years. Ukraine, for much of its 30 years of independence, was riven by division and discord, but it was also a Ukraine with a vibrant political culture, where sitting presidents weren't guaranteed re-election, and where the people knew that they could, and they sometimes did, push back. All these things, of course, completely unheard of in post-Soviet Russia. This Ukraine had become a united Ukraine with a seemingly different and more inclusive concept of being Ukrainian than they'd ever had before. So how had I gotten right the things that I had gotten right before the war, and how had I gotten wrong the things that I'd gotten wrong? How was I going to understand and try to explain what was happening? Right? With history courses that intentionally come up to the present, I knew that I would be teaching about this for the rest of my career. How was I going to explain it? I began to listen, to read, to listen more, to listen to political scientists, to military analysts, to journalists, but above all else, probably given who I am, to listen to historians. Whenever we want to understand the present, we always turn to the past. We often do it implicitly without quite thinking about it. We judge today by what we know from our own personal experience, but also by what we know about history. We don't always state it clearly, but it's always there behind our thoughts. So I began to think that I needed to do this, in fact, explicitly, explore the connection between the past and the present, to determine how history could and perhaps how it could not help me to understand this war. And I thought, what better way to do this than to do it publicly with my students in the space of the classroom, and to do it with the OLLI community here at Tallwood and online. And what better way to allow these communities to participate with me in this effort, to understand, than by inviting the historians whose work, whose research, whose writing has been so helpful to me in trying to make sense of this so far. I have so many questions that are still at best only partially answered. And I hope in conversations with you in the next few months, we can work together to try to come up with some answers. Where does this resilient Ukrainian community come from? And how has the space of Ukraine gone from a site of some of the worst anti-Semitic violence in European history to a place that could elect a Jewish president by overwhelming margins? Has the meaning of being Ukrainian changed? And if so, for whom has it changed, and how has it changed? And where do those changes come from? For that matter, why have so few Russians stood up to speak out against this war? Why did Putin launch this infernal war? How does that relate to the history of Russian imperialism? Or is it maybe a product of Putin's own past as a member of the late Soviet secret police, the KGB? Or does it relate maybe to the disaster of the Soviet collapse and the so-called transition to capitalism and democracy that actually meant utter impoverishment for the bulk of the population? So these are just the beginning of the questions that I want us to work together on answering here in the next few months. To start off today, I want you to start thinking somewhat about what national identity means. And then we'll look at some maps together, maybe some bits of history together, prep ourselves for the weeks to come, hopefully leave some time for some questions today. But what I want you to understand first and foremost is that national identity is something that is historically constructed. which is to say, for much of history, the world was divided into competing empires, and most people identified with a locality because they didn't usually travel very far from home. And they might identify with being subjects of a particular ruler, but they didn't identify with the nationalities that we understand today. In fact, it's only in the 18th and the 19th century, especially due to the coming of the French Revolution, of the Enlightenment, of these ideas that sovereignty belongs to the people, that we start to see questions arise of who exactly constitutes this people. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the Russian nation is an invention of history. The Ukrainian nation is an invention of history. This doesn't make it fake. It doesn't make it false. The notion of the nation as something primordial, as something that goes back into prehistory, well, that itself is a modern invention. That idea is a modern invention. But it's one that's often used to justify rule over a particular group of people or a particular territory. So all I'm trying to say here is that the formation of the nation, the formation of national identity, of the national community, that itself has a history. And to understand that identity, we have to understand that history. I think actually in some ways we're in a better position than Europeans to understand this question. We know, of course, that the formation of the American people has a history, right? Because we know we didn't exist as a country 300 years ago. But the American people, although it is an invention of history, is very real. It's something that people feel themselves part of. But the question of national community comes with all kinds of questions. Questions that are constantly being re-asked and re-answered. So fundamentally, nationalism asserts, and I'll follow here, and there are many different writers on this subject, but I'll follow a historian and Canadian historian, Paul Robert Magoshi, emeritus at the University of Toronto. And he writes that nationalism is a way of thinking that asserts two fundamental things. One, that humankind is divided into various peoples or nationalities. And two, that the optimal socio-political system, so the optimal organization of our lives, is one in which each people or nationality should enjoy cultural and political autonomy, or preferably full sovereignty and independent statehood. So let's think about that for a minute, right? So it's this concept that the world is divided into nationalities, that they're real. They're often presented by nationalists as primordial, as something that has always existed. And those people have a right to sovereignty. They have a right to political and cultural autonomy, and they have a right to independent statehood. This is the idea of nationalism that we talk about emerging in the 18th and the 19th centuries. But the big question, who constitutes peoples? Who constitutes nationalities? This is a big question. This is what is being built in the 19th century, this concept, and it changes over time. Is it a matter of citizenship? Being citizens of the same state? Is that what makes a national community? A nationality? Is it a matter of ethnic origin? By the way, ethnic groups are themselves a product of historical development. Is it a product of religion, of native language, of shared culture? So many of these things, right, themselves change over time. And so many of what come to be identified as national groups, as nationalities, they differ in some of these categories among themselves. So what does it mean? What can it mean? Can you be ethnically Russian and also Ukrainian? Can you be religiously Jewish and also Ukrainian? Can you speak Russian or Yiddish or Polish or Crimean Tatar? Can that be your native language? And can you also be Ukrainian? I'm focused here on Ukrainians, but this is a question that's being asked all over the place. For much of history, and for some who self-identified, and here we'll talk about Ukraine specifically, but we can talk about this as a topic of debate in many other places. For much of history, and for some who self-identified as Ukrainian nationalists, a lot of these questions were answered with an emphatic no. In what we sometimes call integral nationalism or radical nationalism, Ukraine was to be for Ukrainians, by which they meant those of a particular ethnic heritage, who spoke a particular language, who shared a particular culture. Others did not belong on the territory of Ukraine. And not infrequently, integral or radical nationalists mete out violence against those that they see as not fitting into their vision of what the Ukrainian people should be. So is nationalism inherently violent and morally problematic? I'd say not necessarily. There are other visions of nationalism and national identity. We refer sometimes to a civic nationalism. Sometimes it's called a political nationalism. The idea that people who are citizens of the same state are part of the same national community. In this vision, you can be Russian and Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian, Polish and Ukrainian, Jewish and Ukrainian, and of course, Ukrainian and Ukrainian. And what I believe we see, and that change that I talk about in the last decade in Ukraine, is that the bulk of the population, I would say especially since the so-called Revolution of Dignity, or what you might remember as the Euromaidan Revolution in 2013, 2014, and in the midst of this war that's been going on with Russia now for 8 years, the bulk of the population, not everybody, but the bulk of the population subscribes to just this notion of Ukrainian identity, of Ukrainian nationalism, and inclusive nationalism. A nationalism that envisions a space for Crimean Tatars to be Ukrainian, or Russians to be Ukrainian, if they are part of this state. It's a patriotic nationalism. And it is the complete opposite of the way Putin thinks about nationality. Putin, right again, asserts that the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian people, does not exist. And therefore, they have no rights. So if we think of Magoshi again, right, that definition that he had of nationalism, Ukrainians do not have the right to cultural and political autonomy, or preferably full sovereignty and independent statehood, because they are not a nation. This is Putin's belief, certainly not mine. Putin's belief justifies his invasion, and it allows for a tremendous amount of violence to be used in what has been referred to by Russians as de-Ukrainianization. They have talked about re-educating Ukrainians to remove this national identity. Genocide has been justified as something other than genocide because the Ukrainian nation does not, in fact, exist. And therefore, for Putin, its destruction, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation, is just to return things to what is right, to return them to being Russians, as he understands them. So that's just one concept for us to think about and talk about as we go forward. I want to take a look at just a few pieces of what is obviously a huge history here that backgrounds this war. Like I say, I'll try not to go on too long, so we have some time for Q&A today, but our next two sessions are especially intended. I'm not going to come in and lecture to you. I'm going to come in and we're going to have a discussion. We're going to have a conversation. But I think to help you better understand the speakers to come, it's good to have some background here. So what I want us to understand is that history can be used a lot of ways in relation to the present. And one of those ways is about competing claims to legitimacy. So you make historical claims in order to legitimize rule. So here in particular, I'll point to just one moment, but we can talk about a number of historical disagreement between Ukrainians and Russians that have a direct relationship to a claim of legitimacy. So they both claim the medieval state called Kievan Rus. The Russians, of course, spell it in the Russian style, K-I-E-V-A-N. I have intentionally chosen to spell it in the Ukrainian style, but what I'm going to tell you is that the people of Kievan Rus didn't think of themselves as Ukrainians or as Russians. So both also make a claim to this guy, Velodimir, if you use the Ukrainian spelling, Vladimir, if you use the Russian spelling. He was a grand prince in the late 10th century, important for his conversion to Christianity and converting the people of Kievan Rus to Christianity, and so claimed as an important figure in both of their histories. So here we have a statue of Saint Velodimir that sits in Kiev that comes from 1853, from precisely this moment in the 19th century when Ukrainians are building their concept of Ukrainian national identity. Russians building theirs at the same time. And here's a brand new statue of Vladimir the Great. That's Putin, by the way, there, speaking at the opening. 2016, this is not an accident, right? 2014, the war begins. 2016, here's Russia making a dramatic claim, right? That's the walls of the Kremlin off to the right there. Putting this in a very central spot in the city of Moscow to stake their claim to Kievan Rus, to stake their claim to this place. And most maps of this actually should be even messier looking, because it was about control of territory by all of these different principalities. Kiev was the most important of them, clearly. A lot of the sons of the Kievan princes went on to rule these different principalities. Muscovy, the founding of Moscow, will be, in fact, sort of on the outskirts of all of this and very late in the process. Russia traces its history through the lineage of rulers, tracing it back to the princes of the line that ultimately goes to Kiev. Ukrainians, of course, say, hey, this is our territory. This is where we live and where we have lived. See the way in which history is used to legitimize, to justify. Maps, by the way, also used to legitimize and to justify. This I call a garbage map. It actually contains a lot of truth in it, but it is fundamentally intended for nefarious purposes. It was published in the Washington Times. They produce these sponsored pieces. Somebody pays to publish there. The article that goes along with it's pretty gross. But you'll see this claim online today that this, where it says Ukraine in 1654, that this is all that Ukraine is. And okay, if you want an independent Ukraine, that's what you get and nothing else. And then they'll say, look, you know, this was added at this moment in history and this was added at that moment in history. And by the way, let's blame Lenin and the Bolsheviks for the communists, right, of giving Russian territory to Ukraine. Look, borders are historically constructed. This state that they're talking about here from Ukraine in 1654, this is a Cossack hetmanate, which, yes, Ukrainians claim as part of their heritage. But it's ridiculous not to talk about these other places as part of Ukraine because the people who live there consider themselves Ukrainian. We could do the same thing if we come over to this map. And I could say, Russia. Russia is just that little green circle in the middle. That's the kingdom of Muscovy in something odd, right, in the 15th century. I could say, oh, that's all that Russia really ever was. And everything else is just, you know, this is what you can do with maps, but you shouldn't. So we need to talk about and to think about the real history a little bit. And we need to think about Russia as an empire, right? We need to think about Russia as an empire. It looks different than what we often talk about and think about as empires. It is a land empire. So it's not an overseas empire like the British Empire, but it is an empire nonetheless. These are colonies. These are territories that came under the rule of Russian czars as a result of conquest. They're just not overseas. It looks different. It's contiguous, and therefore there is more legitimacy sometimes granted to the notion that therefore all of the Russian Empire is Russia. Even today, Russia is a product of this imperial expansion. A lot of those territories in that map, right, are now independent countries, and Poland, Finland, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, et cetera, right? A lot of these places are now independent countries. But Russia as it exists today is still a product of that imperial expansion. It still has geographically compact populations who identify ethnically as non-Russian and who at times want independence. You remember the wars with Chechnya. That's what this is about, right? It's the aftermath of empire. So I asked this question, right? Is all of the Russian Empire Russia? I mean, do we think India is Britain because it was once part of the British Empire? Because this is the claim that Putin is making. Ukraine was once part of the Russian Empire, and so therefore it's Russia. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but not much because he's not that complicated a guy. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the turning of the Soviet Union into 15 independent countries, that was a moment of decolonization. It wasn't necessarily understood that way as people were going through it. It's not what a lot of people necessarily wanted out of that collapse, but it is in fact what happened. And I put here, right, and maybe it's a moment of incomplete decolonization because maybe there are still the remnants of imperialism present here. So this is a map of Ukrainian territory in the 19th century. It's a little bit of a mess to look at. It's got these really sort of light green lines and things on here that represent sort of the extent of the territory populated by people who speak the Ukrainian language and are ethnic Ukrainian. The main thing that I'm wanting to show you here is that the place that is today Ukraine was separated between empires. And in fact, for much of its history, what is today Ukraine was separated. This is treated as therefore false, what is today Ukraine, by people like the guy who put this thing in the Washington Times. But this is the story of a lot of the peoples of Eastern Europe, right? Europe, especially Eastern Europe of the 19th century, was divided by four great empires: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman. And we have all these independent countries that emerge out of it as a result of the end of World War I, right? Ukraine, the big loser there at the end of World War I. Ukraine is the biggest minority ethnic population in Europe after World War I, the one that didn't get its own country, becomes part of the Soviet Union, but not only, right? So here is the territory of what is today Ukraine between the wars. And you'll see that it's still divided. So this is also a complicated and messy map because there are these various moments that there are, in fact, independent Ukrainian states. They don't last for very long in the midst of what we call the Russian Civil War. The end of World War I, the revolution, all of this period's a huge mess, right? There's wars between Poland and Ukrainians and Russians, and the Russians, it's the communists and the anti-communists and all of this kind of stuff. But what comes out of this in the end is that today's Ukraine is largely divided between the Soviet Union, which is officially formed in 1922 and called that, in which Ukraine, so much of what is today Ukraine, but Ukraine, the Ukrainian Republic, is one of the constituent elements of a federal system that's called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That Union of Republics, Ukraine is one of its most important founders, and that's in part, in fact, a concession to Ukrainian nationalism because these Ukrainians want independence. And this is kind of what Lenin and the Bolsheviks said, you know, we probably better do something there or we're going to continue to face trouble. But a lot of what is today Ukraine is in Poland in the interwar period. There's small bits that are in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania. But still, what is today Ukraine is divided, and it stays that way until we get to 1939. 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it's called by all kinds of names. This is the prelude to World War II. August 23rd, I think it is, right? They signed this agreement between Hitler and Stalin, two of the bloodiest dictators in human history, decide to carve up Eastern Europe. Publicly, all it promised is that in the case of a war, they wouldn't go to war against one another. But there were these secret protocols where they decided who was going to get what. And so World War II starts on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. But on September 17th, 1939, the Soviet Union invades Poland from the other direction. Ask Russians, most Russian friends of mine, ask them when World War II started. They'll tell you June 22nd, 1941. This is an uncomfortable period in their history to talk about. It was sold by the Bolsheviks, sold by Stalin, that they were protecting Ukrainians and Belarusians and ultimately Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians. This is the end of a lot of independent countries in the interwar period. But these additions to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, mostly at the expense of Poland, though the borders of Poland then move at the expense of Germany further to the west after the war. But most of these territories make up what is today Ukraine. They do get bits from, like I say, Romania, Hungary, other places, but the bulk of the territory we're talking about comes from what was Poland in the interwar period. The last edition here we're thinking about, well, you see down where it says KRIM, right? So I'm over here in front of the screen for a moment. So this territory here, right? Crimea, which you've certainly heard a lot about, right? Annexed by Russia in 2014. This became part of the Ukrainian Republic in 1954. It was called the so-called Gift of Crimea. So it was part of the Russian Republic inside the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev transferred that to the Ukrainian Republic. Mostly did it because it was, I mean, its economic ties, the economic ties of Crimea were much more in the Southern Ukrainian Republic. It was also easier to govern from the Ukrainian Republic. So there is a land bridge here. There is no connection here until recently when Russia built a bridge. But there was no land connection from the Russian Republic to Crimea. Of course, as I always tell my students, right, this would be like taking some tiny little chunk of Virginia and giving it to Maryland. Has some impact, right? But ultimately, we're still talking about moving borders within one country. And that's kind of what it was in 1954. But this becomes the borders of independent Ukraine when the Soviet Union collapses. So let's go to the Soviet collapse. Let's jump forward a little bit in history. 1991. In August of 1991, right? So we had Mikhail Gorbachev come to power. He just died. So I'm sure you've seen it in the news, right? I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if this guy hadn't become the leader, because it was precisely the moment that I went to college that he was in power. I started college the fall of 1989, watched people dance on top of the Berlin Wall sitting in my dorm room, and got interested in this part of the world. But he basically reformed the Soviet Union to death. And there is this moment then in August of 1991 that you might remember, a coup attempt, an attempt to replace Gorbachev by communist hardliners that fails. And this accelerates the end of the Soviet Union. So almost immediately after, we have things like the Parliament of the Ukrainian Republic declaring independence. This happens in most of the former Soviet republics at this point. But the real death knell in many respects comes on December 1st, 1991, when a referendum was held in the Ukrainian Republic asking if they wanted independence from the Soviet Union. 92% voted in favor. Every single region of Ukraine voted in favor of independence from the Soviet Union. That includes Luhansk, that includes Donetsk, that includes Crimea, although there it was closer than anywhere else. But every part of Ukraine voted for that independence. And what I want to emphasize here is a couple of agreements, and there's a lot of detail here, and we don't need to go through all the detail, but there is a signature of what was called the Velodimir Accords between the heads of the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian republics that put an end to the Soviet Union. That's the legal end of the Soviet Union. And importantly, in the text of that document, agreed to by the leaders of those three republics who become the first presidents of those three independent countries, they will respect each other's territorial integrity and the inviolability of existing borders. Russia agrees to this again in 1994 when Ukraine signs an agreement to give up its nuclear weapons. The Soviet nuclear arsenal ends up divided in some way among four of the newly independent countries, and the United States was certainly very involved in trying to convince those countries to return the weapons to Russia. They were really afraid of nuclear proliferation that could come out of this. And again, signed by Russia, signed by the United States, by the UK, by Ukraine. There are actually 3 Budapest memorandums with those other independent states as well. It's ultimately actually signed also by France and by China, so by all the major nuclear powers. Ukraine agrees to give up its nuclear warheads, and the signatories promise to respect sovereignty, independence, and existing borders. So here again, Russia has made a legal commitment to those existing borders. So the post-Soviet story is certainly one that is worth extended discussion that we don't have time for. I have another lecture that I do for public audiences sometimes on how the 1990s are in fact the roots of Putinism. But what we see is a massive economic collapse. We see failures in the realm of democracy. We see incredible corruption as a state-owned economy is privatized into individual hands and into the hands of just a few. And so we see, in fact, that the story looks similar in Ukraine and in Russia. This, by the way, I was talking with my students, I showed them this, and I had it pulled up on the web where you could actually look at each of these numbers. So this is a total decline of over 60% in the size of the economy by the time we get to the end of the 1990s. That is significantly higher by percentages than the decline of the US economy during the Great Depression. And this happens in Ukraine and Russia. And actually most of the former communist states go through some version of this. It doesn't always look exactly the same. But I think this is important background to understand a couple of other things. And we'll talk about these things and then talk about the beginning of the war and then stop for today. So Ukrainians are frustrated, aggravated, annoyed. Their life has gotten so much worse. The system seems corrupt. Oligarchs, these newly wealthy billionaires who have privatized the state illegally. It's happening in Russia too, by the way, but I'm gonna tell you the Ukrainian story here because the Ukrainian response is different. So we get to 2004, and the guy who was the president for most of the 90s is going to step aside and has picked a successor and kind of supports him, right? But there's actually real elections happening here still. We don't see this in Russia by the time we get to this point. And there is a disputed election. In fact, we have quite a lot of good evidence that the electoral results were falsified. That the Central Electoral Commission, it was a very centralized electoral system, unlike ours, is literally changing the results. And we have evidence of that. And the population in Kiev turns out in massive numbers, and they stay out. In winters that aren't Washington, D.C. winters, right? It's real winter there. And they stay out, and they demand that this be fixed. So it comes to be called the Orange Revolution. Orange didn't have any actually particular meaning in Ukraine, but it comes to be the Orange Revolution because orange was the color of the banners and all of this kind of stuff of the candidate who got ripped in this election. I'm not even going to talk about the names of all these people. It's complicated. It confused my students when I talked to them about it a week ago. But they manage through putting a tremendous amount of pressure by being out there, by refusing to go away. And because the outgoing guy wasn't willing to use violence to stop this, they end up convincing the constitutional court in Ukraine to order a rerun of the election, and their candidate wins. This is, boy, this freaks Putin out like you can't imagine. So this is one, I don't know if you've heard the phrase color revolutions. This is one of those color revolutions that happened in a lot of former Soviet states. They tended to be around fraudulent elections and people protesting. I can't imagine why Putin would find this nerve-wracking. Because what he feared right there's every single Russian election. Oh my goodness, the evidence of, I mean, it's the kind of things that our former president has in his fever dreams that he thinks happened here, but in fact actually happened there and happen all the time and on the regular. Putin thinks this is the work of the US State Department. He thinks this is the work of George Soros. He has a thing about Soros. So does our far-right politicians have a thing about Soros too. But Putin has a thing about Soros. There's an anti-Semitic component to that too, clearly. But Putin is afraid, in part, he's afraid of vibrant civil society, of a society that says we don't have to put up with it. And we'll come out and we'll tell you what we think. And you know what? If you're our guy, you best do something for us. So in 2010, the next presidential election, the guy who becomes president as a result of the Orange Revolution can only manage 5% of the vote in the first round of the election. This, to me, is the healthiest thing about the Ukrainian political system. It's got a lot of problems, don't get me wrong. But the healthiest thing is that if you come in and you don't do the job, you're gone. So in 2010, believe it or not, they actually elect the guy that had fraudulently tried to come to power in 2004. And this is Viktor Yanukovych, you've probably heard about if you remember what happens in 2013, 2014. And in that winter, the Orange Revolution comes to look small. So it started actually over something that wasn't that significant in some ways. It was the decision of the Ukrainian president to pull out of an association agreement, it was called, with the European Union. This was not to become a member of the European Union, but many in the population saw this as a sign that Ukraine was choosing to be more like Russia and less like Europe. Their concept of Europe, by the way, looks, I think, sometimes different than what the European Union actually looks like. But it's that concept in their mind, the concept of the rule of law, of a battle against corruption, of a functioning democracy. This is what they believed they were losing. At first, only a small number turned out. There was an Afghan-Ukrainian journalist, Mustafa Naim, who wrote on Facebook, basically, are we going to put up with this? Come out to Maidan, to the square in Kiev. He writes on Facebook, likes don't count. So come out with your bodies. Don't just click like on your social media, right? You have to actually do something. And it wasn't long after that the Yanukovych administration tries to use violence to remove these folks from the square. Mostly young people at first, the age of my kids, probably many of your grandkids. And And when they use violence against them, the parents and the grandparents and the aunts and the uncles and everybody comes out. And I said, we're not going to let you do this to our people. And they stayed out for months, from late November until late February, through a serious winter. And you can see the size of the crowds that we were talking about. This was taken on December 8th, 2013, this picture. I won't go through the details here, but in late February, Ukrainian government sort of anti-uprising kinds of forces. So the Yanukovych's guys open fire, not tear gas, not rubber bullets. They shoot people. And yet these folks don't give up until eventually, and like I say, it's a complicated story exactly what happens, but suddenly the people guarding Yanukovych are like, yeah, we're done with you, guy. And he decides to flee the country. This is what it all looked like in the aftermath. He flees the country. The Ukrainian parliament declares that he has abandoned his office. They remove him from the presidency. They put in place a new president temporarily. They hold snap elections. And by the way, if you ever get a chance, watch the documentary Winter on Fire. It's on Netflix. It's also freely available on YouTube if you don't subscribe to Netflix. Had my students watch it last week. It is incredibly moving. And it ends in this triumphant mode of the victory of this revolution of dignity. This is what Ukrainians call it now. But the victory didn't last. So we come back to our map of Ukraine. And it's almost immediately after Yanukovych flees. In fact, there is evidence, and it's still a bit unsure, but there's evidence that that night, as they're talking about how to, in Russia, I'm talking here, they're talking about how to get Yanukovych out of Ukraine, that Putin says something to the effect of, I think it's about time we do something about returning Crimea to Russia. Some dispute about whether this happened or not, but we almost immediately see the start of conflict in Crimea. So in Crimea, there is in Sevastopol, which is not on the map here, but it's on the coast, there is a naval base that was the home of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Black Sea Fleet was divided between Russia and Ukraine, although the vast majority of it went to Russia. But Russia maintained a lease on the naval base in Sevastopol. So they had troops actually present in Crimea already. But then we start to see the appearance of what were called at the time the Little Green Men. So it was these guys with military uniforms on without insignia, but all of their equipment just happened to look very Russian. And all of a sudden they're occupying the parliament and they're forcing the parliament to hold a vote, demanding autonomy, and then ultimately like demanding a referendum. And over time, the referendum changes and it's going to be a referendum on independence from Ukraine and joining Russia. This is what the electoral campaign looked like in Crimea. So the map outline here is Crimea, right? It says on the 16th of March, we'll choose. And what are your choices, Russian Crimea or Nazi Crimea? That's the way it was being portrayed. And that's the way that the Russian media portrayed that Euromaidan revolution, that revolution of dignity throughout. They portrayed it as the work of neo-Nazis, as the work, again, of course, of the US State Department and NATO and the European Union and George Soros, I'm sure. And in part, like, this is the news that people in Crimea were getting. This is the news that a lot of people in Eastern Ukraine were getting. They're watching Russian television stations. This is what they're seeing about all of these events that are taking place. And on March 16th, they hold this referendum, and the official announced results are that 96% approximately of the population voted for independence from Ukraine and to join Russia. And they claimed something like 83% turnout. And forgive me if the numbers aren't exactly right here. We don't know for sure what the real results are. We can guarantee you that those are not the real results. I mean, the Crimean Tatars were better than 10% of the population of Crimea, and there's no way they want to return to Russia. So the best estimates that I've seen are that turnout was maybe something like 30%, and that between 50 and 60% of the actual votes were votes for independence. So it was a majority of those who voted, but it's like 15% of the whole republic, of the whole peninsula. Since that time, of course, Russia has had control. The Ukrainian government said, yeah, we're just going to pull the military out. There's only this one small little land connection up here at the very northern part of Crimea to Ukraine. So with all of these Russian troops already present, it was very easy for them to cut off, and Ukraine just decided that they weren't going to engage in a fight. The Ukrainian military was in bad shape in 2014. This is also then when we see the conflict begin in eastern Ukraine. So here in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, so together they're collectively referred to often as Donbass. So the Donetsk whole basin, so Bass is from basin. So there, in fact, are anti-Maidan protests that go on in a lot of Ukrainian cities. It's a vibrant civic culture. Not everybody agrees. That's good. In some of these locations in the very easternmost parts, and not, by the way, not the entirety of these regions that you see here, only in the easternmost parts of it. I can't remember. I do have a map here. So the lines, as you might understand, between 2014 and 2022 don't stay the exact same the whole time, but I just give you a snapshot here. This is up to February 24th to give you a sense of the space that we're talking about. But we have once again here up here the little green men. We have Russia sending weapons in, but we actually have Russian citizens coming in and heading supposedly separatist militias, but in fact militias that have a lot of Russians directly involved. Russia will deny throughout that its actual military was there, but there's a lot of evidence to say otherwise. Let me show you this then. By the way, between 2014 and 2022, there are, by the way, dozens of potential peace agreements here. They're constantly being violated. And between 2014 and 2022, and it's estimated that 14,000 people died as a result of the war in eastern Ukraine. This is before February 24th. A lot of those civilian deaths. Absolute devastation in this territory. Obviously, a lot of internal migrants, a lot of people who fled to Russia too, but a lot of people fled to other parts of Ukraine. So let's look at real quick this. So I just want to end with this map. Starts February 24th. When the invasion happens. This is going to take us up to April 7th. You can find this on Wikipedia. It's actually quite I think, a well done map just in terms of showing us the dynamic of what happened. The situation in terms of control of territory hasn't changed a lot since April 7th. So April 7th is where it stops here, and you'll notice at the end there that all of these Russian forces represented in the red are pulling back from Kiev, from Sumy, from Chernihiv, from around Kharkiv, and they pull back over here to the east. So this is kind of where we're at the moment. I'm going to stop here for today. This will leave us, good 20 minutes for Q&A, and then I hope you'll all come to the public lecture series. It's entirely online, starts on Monday. It's me, so you get to hear me again. It won't be a complete repeat of what's here. I've intentionally made them different. But then we'll have some absolutely fantastic historians. And then we'll meet back here again in a month or so and talk. So I'm happy to hear questions now.
Yes, sir. There are a number of items in the chat. First one I'll read from Charles Levin. He states that Moscow Times, the Kremlin's war propaganda by former Duma member Vladimir Rizkov, how Putin lied about every single pretext for his illegal annexation of Crimea and launching of his war of aggression in eastern Ukraine. And he refers to a webpage for that as well.
Yeah, so this is actually on tap for me to talk with my students about next week. Why did Putin do it? Both in 2014, but also in 22, why did Putin do it? And there's the public claims that were being made, right? And Putin is, especially when we talk about the lead up to February 24th of this year, talks about so-called genocide, which he claims that Ukrainian government is carrying out against the ethnic Russian and the Russian-speaking population of Eastern Ukraine. It's complete garbage, this explanation. And in fact, it becomes a justification for genocide carried out by Russian forces, by incredible violence being carried out by Russian forces. So he's portraying, and he portrays the Zelensky government, right? So this Jewish man who is the president of Ukraine now, portrays them as Nazi, as neo-Nazi. And this is the way that he constantly talks about. So some of the justifications for the war at the beginning, we're going to denazify Ukraine. We're going to Ukrainianize Ukraine. There are also, of course, claims made about NATO. I mean, he didn't fear NATO, and NATO has nothing to do with this. If Ukraine had said, hey, we promise we will forever never be part of NATO, this would have still happened. There's no question about it. We see all kinds of evidence behind this. It's quite ironic, isn't it, that he didn't want NATO on the Russian border, and instead he got Finland to enter NATO. Other explanations that he was giving, right? They're all just patently absurd. It is clear that this is an imperialist war. It's clear that this is a war for the reclamation of what he thinks of as a greater Russia, by which he means Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, possibly even northern Kazakhstan in the long run. I don't think, by the way, that he was looking to recreate the Soviet Union. I don't think he cares about Kyrgyzstan. And by the way, you know who one of the people who promoted this idea of this greater Russia? Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You all probably remember who this is, right? Great Soviet dissident, writer on the history of the Gulag. That's exactly what I study. But this incredible Russian nationalist, and he wrote about these lands as being Russian lands. So you want to take a question from there? We also have a question in here.
Okay. Is it on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Okay. I thought your discussion about the nationalism is very interesting because I see it happening in other places. But to me, it seems to be no wonder other countries are starting to fear being taken over, because there are Russians living in Finland, everywhere. And he also made it a point to put, Putin made it a point to put Russians in different places. So he can claim that that's, I didn't understand why that was happening, but now I understand that he was putting more Russians in other places like Ukraine and Belarus and other places so that he could claim that they had a Russian identity and therefore were part of Russia. Do you see it that way, or?
I think you make a really excellent point. So when I was talking about this claim of genocide, against Russians and Russian speakers as one of his justifications here. He has for a while now talked about the Russian world. This is one of the ideologies that I think stands behind this, and he claims to be the protector of Russians who, as he would understand it, were stranded when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so it's not necessarily about putting Russians in these places. The Russians are already there. And that is a result of centuries of settler colonialism, right? Russians moved into these places. Russians lived in every single republic of the former Soviet Union when it collapsed. And Putin's claim to be their protector gives him the right, and you know, he'll talk about his near abroad when they talk about foreign policy, and they claim the right to have a bigger say, at the very least, in all of these countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. And part of that claim is about the ethnic Russians that live in these territories, or about Russian speakers. And one of the interesting things that's happening in Ukraine right now, and there are lots of reports of this, is people, and understand most Ukrainians speak both Russian and Ukrainian. So you can talk about Russian speakers there, but they probably speak Ukrainian, and you can talk about Ukrainian speakers, but they probably speak Russian. So you have people there who grew up with their home language, right? What they spoke at home among themselves was Russian. Itself actually a result in part of colonialism. And they are now intentionally choosing to speak at home and in public Ukrainian, in part because they don't want Putin to have claim over them. If he claims he's coming here to protect me for this, I don't want his protection, because I said, look at the places that are suffering the most as a result of this war. It's precisely those areas that have populations of people who identified Russian as their native language, as their home language. He's killing Russians in claiming to protect Russians. He's also obviously killing Ukrainians, and he's killing Ukrainians who speak Russian as their native language, but also speak Ukrainian. You'll see, by the way, sometimes maps. I didn't include one in here. I include it with talking with my students. You'll see maps that are out there sometimes of the ethno-linguistic territories of Ukraine, and it makes it out like, you know, because the maps provide these nice, tidy little lines. And it'll say, you know, in this part, like, people speak Russian, and in this part, people speak Ukrainian. And here in Crimea, we'll color it all brown because it was the only part of Ukraine that had an ethnic Russian majority. So we're going to color that brown and call that something different. But that doesn't mean that these people can't, one, speak another language. And in fact, you hear lots of tales of people in Ukraine as a natural, normal part of their life. You go stand in the street, I speak to you in Russian, you speak to me in Ukrainian. We're all good with that because we both understand both languages. And so these maps do violence to what life is really like there. Life is mixed. It's not these tight, needy, not these little lines that you'll see. So beware when you hear this described as an ethnic conflict. Beware when you hear this described as a conflict between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. It's not what's going on. Yes, sir.
Yeah. How do they, well, two things. How do they justify him saying this is all one people after Stalin's forced starvation, killing tens of millions, after, well, a young guy who used to work for me came from the Ukraine, but went to university in Moscow and felt very discriminated against. And it just and Putin just seems to have become much more radicalized. I mean, I was in Russia during the Medvedev period, and they all said, "Oh yeah, Russia's real. I mean, Putin's really in charge. Medvedev is, you know, his buddy, and doesn't really matter." But they sort of felt the economy's doing well relative to what it was. And so even though everything was corrupt and Putin was squirreling away billions, etc., first, they were free to talk about it. And secondly, they weren't planning on doing anything. But since then, it seems Putin has become much more radicalized. And do you have I mean, I realize it's sort of two questions.
No,
One,
there's lots there. And
Yeah.
of course, I immediately am like, man, we talk about the history, this and that and the other. So this concept that Ukrainians are really Russians really comes from the 19th century. And it's in part about competition among empires for loyalty of populations. And it's a moment in which you have the rising of these national identities among Serbs and Bulgarians, and Ukrainians are part of this, Russians, Poles, all of this kind of stuff. And they're balancing one off against another. And the Russian imperial power develops an ideology that says that there is one great Russian people made up of three tribes, essentially, we could think of it. The Little Russians, and this is the word they used for Ukrainians, Malorossiya. So Maloruskia, the Little Russians. The White Russians, Belarusia, so Belarus. Bieli is white in Russian. And the Great Russians, which are those that we would today call Russians. They intentionally, in 1863, I believe it is, they outlaw the publication of any works in the Russian Empire in the Ukrainian language. In that they are so dismissive of the very existence of Ukrainian language, they describe it as an invention of Poles. This is Putin's history, right? Is that he's taking what the Russian imperial state was saying as true. It's not until 1905 that you can publish in the Ukrainian language in the Russian Empire. So this is part of where that story all comes from. But the radicalization of Putin, I think, is absolutely clear. I do think that there are lots of components that I've been studying this stuff since I entered college in 1989, things that I didn't pay enough attention to. If you look at the way that Ukrainians are portrayed in film, in Russian film, they're always portrayed as, these kind of hicks. They're not very smart. They're, so this discrimination that you're talking about is a discrimination that treats Ukrainian as not quite Russian, the language. So why can't you speak good Russian, right? It treats them as somehow sort of less than, right? Not smart enough, not this, not that. And we can find that I see it in films now in ways that I'm like, oh my God, I never paid attention to that character as Ukrainian, in part because I speak Russian, but I don't speak it like a native. So I don't always capture all of the little subtleties of what's going on in there. So all of this is like percolating. In the 1990s, as everything's going to hell, we have the rise of a populist Russian nationalism. And one of the things those populists start claiming already in the 1990s is that we need Crimea back. Crimea has big symbolic importance for Russians. So this is all kind of a background before we even get to Putin. But there is no doubt to me that Putin has changed. He was never a nice guy, right? He was never going to be a Democrat. He was never going to hold a real, genuine election. Right, I can tell you, like, if they have an election tomorrow, Putin's going to get 70% of the vote because he always does, and they make sure he always does. After 2011, 2012, so it's actually precisely that moment at which Medvedev and Putin switch places. So Putin goes back to officially being the president, even though we're pretty sure he was in control. That winter, I still remember I was teaching over here on campus, right? And I come in, it was the last week of class, December 2011. And I said, guys, I don't know what to tell you. This amazing thing happened over the weekend. Putin appeared at an MMA fight in Moscow and the people started booing. Oh, God. So I've never seen anything like this before. What's this all about? And there was a way that for some people, and it's a small portion of the population, but for some people, when Putin and Medvedev made this public announcement in September 2011 that they were going to trade places, it kind of ripped the mask off the whole thing. And like, oh yeah, we never really had any say in any of this at all. They're just telling us what jobs they're going to take. And people turned out to protest. Those December protests that year after parliamentary elections, people turning out in big numbers, bigger numbers than had ever happened since the August 91 coup, to protest. Presidential elections that happen in March, again, evidence of irregularities. ballot boxes that are already stuffed when the first people arrive at the polls, poll workers off in the corner filling out stacks of ballots, people writing ballots and realizing that the ink is erasable. And there's YouTube videos of all this stuff, right, that people are taking that day, and people turn out to protest. And Putin's electoral campaign heading into that March 2012 election takes a hard nationalist turn. He'd always been pretty nationalist, but this was a whole different level. All of a sudden, like, Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church are, you know, super tight, right? They're going to suddenly start an anti-immigrant politics is going to come to the fore. They're going to ultimately make a lot of this protest illegal. They're going to adopt anti-LGBT laws. So there's this turn in his politics that happens at that moment. And oh, by the way, who does he hate as a result of those protests? Hillary Clinton, US Secretary of State at the time. Michael McFaul, who was the US ambassador to Russia, who I knew at Stanford when I was in grad school because he was a professor of political science there, who is now, by the way, one of the most bombastic speakers against Russia in this war, actually too much sometimes, probably. If you want to know the roots of why 2016 happened the way 2016 happened, you also have to understand why he hated Hillary Clinton. Don't think he ever thought Trump would win, but he wanted to weaken Hillary Clinton in any way possible. So anyway, I know I've kind of gone a long way with that question. There's a lot of things going on there. There's lots more history that we can talk about. I didn't even get to the discussion of the famine that you brought up, which is really important to all of this. But we'll have other occasions to talk more. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Joel Ryder asks, when Putin dies, who is his likely successor? Is this person likely to carry on in the same fashion? Will they govern even more harshly? Is there any hope for a Gorbachev-like figure? And finally, is there any hope?
That's a brilliant question. And for me, as always, I say, hey, let's look at history, because that's always where I start. And I will tell you, as I tell my students, that in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, nobody in their right mind would have said that the Soviet Union will cease to exist in 6.5 years. Anybody who tells you they knew it was coming that quickly, there are some who would have said it can't last forever. But anybody who tells you they knew it was coming that quickly, don't believe them. In fact, you even go back now as a historian and you look at conditions in 1985 and you say, what's the most likely outcome going forward? And it would be sort of a lethargic stability. The thing would have continued to kind of putter along. So history can change rapidly in ways that we don't expect. And I'll tell you, I don't expect it. If Putin dies, I don't expect things are going to get better. If Putin dies, I suspect there's a good chance he's replaced by somebody who's even worse. Patrushev, I mean, there's all kinds of people we talk about. There's no vice Putin out there. It's kind of like there was no vice Stalin or no vice Lenin. Like we didn't know when those guys died who the next person was going to be. We don't know. But I'm not optimistic. I think, by the time Gorbachev came along, that Soviet system had stabilized in this way and was puttering along in this way, where I think there was a possibility for somebody to emerge from within it who would think differently. By the way, Gorbachev didn't want the Soviet Union to come to an end. That was not what he was aiming for. He didn't want to put an end to the socialist system. He was looking to make it work better. So history tells us that we can never be sure. And I love being a historian because I don't have to tell you what's going to happen in 5 years. I get to come to you in 5 years and I'll tell you why what happened was absolutely inevitable. There's one more question here in the room if we'd like.
Excuse me. What about Navalny?
Navalny is a great question. Of course, we would first off have to have somebody who was willing to let Navalny out of his deep, dark recesses of prison where he is. So I'm a scholar of the Gulag. That's what I write about. That's what my books are about. And I tell you, the Russian prison system today bears way too many resemblances to it. And what that guy's going through right now is horrific. And if you see pictures of him from before to today, what it is doing to him and his body and things like that is unspeakable. If he is released, let's imagine a world in which Navalny becomes president tomorrow. Does that make it all better? I don't know. Navalny has said Crimea is Russian and will always be Russian. Ukrainians, for the most part, don't like Navalny. And they can find you lots of quotes and there are moments when he dallied with hardcore right Russian nationalists because they were actually opposed to Putin. And so he was like, well, I'll work with anybody who's opposed to Putin. But all I'm saying is, like, we're not even sure that he brings us something better. Although I'd certainly take my chances with him over Putin. But it's complicated. I just put it this way, I guess, and maybe, we can end with this. I know we're out of time. Oh, we do have 3 minutes. Sorry, I was looking at the clock in the back. It's probably a little off. Well, I'll say this and then we can take another question. Navalny is no Mandela. I have tremendous, tremendous respect for this man. I really do, for what he is doing and what he has done. I would be concerned at what it would bring with him going forward. But again, like I said, give me him over Putin, you bet, in a heartbeat.
Charles Levin writes, Russian FSB colonel admits Crimean MPs forced to vote for referendum, and Putin's Human Rights Council accidentally posted real Crimean election results.
Yes. And in fact, when I said, these are what we kind of think the results are, it's precisely from that. And so, yeah, we're quite certain that that Russia had a hand in all of it. Yeah, I don't think there's any question there. Take one more?
I'll take one more.
Please.
Yeah, I guess since we talked about this in a very historical way, seems when you come down to the core issue here, is this humankind just grabbing what humankind has always done? Whether you go back to the Romans or whoever it is, I just want that property and I'm going to take it. And I think that's where Putin really is at this point. How you justify it, it's just humanity marching along as humanity has marched on historically. Although, frankly, all of us probably in the 21st century think that civilization by now, a major power should not be doing anything like it's doing. But yet, he's acting just like they did thousands of years ago. I want that property. I've got enough violence in my control and enough elites to go with me, and I'm going to grab it. So it seems to me in the course, in the long-term look at history, we've just got human behavior that's exactly the way it's been for thousands of years.
So let me just end with this then today. The general outlook of historians, the general way we think about the world, is that we're very skeptical of the idea that anything has always been the same over the entirety of time. However, democracy is a historical outlier. It's not the historical norm. We like to think that the norm of human development is to develop a democratic system with a capitalist government that respects private property. These are the things we were brought up to believe. History tells us that's not the norm, and that's not necessarily what everybody has wanted over the course of history. So I don't actually dispute your point. I think what Putin is doing is very much a classic imperialism. I do think it's important to understand that imperialism looks different at different times and in different moments. And this is where historians love to talk about difference. We're not like the political scientists who want to strip away all the details and make everything the same and fit it into a formula. Political scientists probably hate me. I'm really being too rough. But historians like to understand the context. They like to understand the specifics of a moment, a place, a culture. And we're going to get some more opportunities to continue to talk about that. And you're going to see, I hope you'll come see some of my favorite historians who have helped me so much in thinking about all of this over the course of the next few months. So thanks for having me, and thanks for being here.